Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us here at Arabella Advisors today for the third in a four-part webinar series that we are convening looking at the future of the social sector. I'm Sampriti Ganguly, I'm Arabella's CEO, and we work here at Arabella each day to help donors on their journey from idea to impact. I think it's fair to say that that impact journey has been filled with equal measures of urgency given our current moment, as well as uncertainty, given the intersecting challenges of catastrophic climate change, an ongoing global pandemic, refugee crisis, the unequal economic fallout of that pandemic, and sustained and longstanding reckoning with racial injustice. It is our privilege to bring together a cross-section of change makers across philanthropy, the public and the private sector, individuals and institutional players, activists, intermediaries, policymakers, and business leaders on the call today. Thank you for joining us. It is our collective privilege that today we will be in conversation with Camille Bousset and Elena Chavez Quesada. And in a moment, I will turn the floor over to each of them to share their origin stories, in essence, what brought them to this work. Before I do so, however, just maybe one goal for our time together and one ask. So for the goal and in the spirit of shared solutions, my hope for today is that each of you will walk away with some concrete ideas for how you might be change makers as individuals and in turn be catalysts for changing practices within your own organizations. And in terms of the ask, just a logistical one, given the fairly large size of this group, we're muted everyone centrally, but we encourage you to use the Q&A function in Zoom. Camille and Elena have graciously agreed to open the virtual floor up for any questions you may have, and I'll plan to do that right about 45 minutes past the hour. In the spirit of lifting up individual voices and making sure that each individual can share their own story, I'd like to turn the floor over to Camille and then Elena to share with us your origin story. We'd love to hear what drew each of you to the arena of financial inclusion, and in spite of the sector's shortcomings, perhaps what motivates you to stay in this field. Camille, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Sampriti, and I want to thank Arabella in particular for the invitation to join all of you. It's a pleasure to be here, pleasure to be with Elena. I will just share with you that, I'm originally, my family are immigrants. I'm not an immigrant, but my family are immigrants, Dominican Republic and Trinidad. And I remember really clearly when I was a little kid, my grandparents and aunts and my mom having conversations about finances and their complete distrust of banks and formal financial institutions. And so they developed their own, methods of savings, and all of that was just circumventing the, official banking sector. And my dad was a little bit more accepting of that because, we set up a checking account, and so there was an official channel, and then there was also an unofficial channel. And I saw those two side by side, and I also knew just, growing up here in the States that there were really different models that didn't look like the model that my family was following. And in terms of just savings, but also in terms of retirement. Like I just think, in my family, the retirement plan was you invest in your kids. Your kids do really well, and that's your retirement plan. And I think that's pretty much what my parents and my grandparents before them had followed. So when I started in this work, I started because I thought there was a big gap between what the formal financial sector wants people to do and the way in which they reach a diverse set of audiences and what was actually happening in families like mine. And I want families like mine to be able to build wealth and to do it in ways that really, that recognize all the hard work and to feel comfortable in the financial system. And so that was, a large part of my motivation. What continues to keep me in the arena is there's a long way to go. I still think we don't make the financial sector as welcoming, particularly for low-income people, as we could, and particularly communities of color. And I think there's just a lot to do. There's a lot to do, particularly on the small entrepreneur side, and a lot to do, to bring people in, to make them feel supported throughout their lifespan and throughout a range of financial decisions. But I'm looking forward to this conversation, and looking forward to hearing what Elena has to say.
It's so wonderful to be here. Thanks, Sampriti and Ben and the whole Arabella team for putting this together, and excited to be in conversation with you, Camille and Sampriti. For me, it's really interesting to hear what you said, Camille, because there are some parts that resonated deeply, as I'm sure for so many of us. I grew up in New Mexico, a large Mexican-American family. Each of my parents were the youngest of 10. And for me, it was quite clear kind of growing up. And then as I started to develop more of an understanding of the systems and structures around them, that, I watched my own family kind of be trapped in those cycles of intergenerational poverty. And even though I didn't have the words for it, for me, it was really clear that a lack of assets, a lack of wealth was missing, and that would unlock that trap that we were stuck in. And really a world where financial inclusion, financial institutions that folks felt safe at, that felt like they would meet their needs, that they trusted, it just wasn't part of the picture. And I would say that's particularly true for women. In my case, Latinas in my family, who are often the matriarchs of the family, not having that kind of system and structure that they could trust. And my parents had the same retirement plan, Camille, which was, let's invest in our kids. And then at the end of the day, yes, it's a very selfless act, and we're so grateful and, indebted to them at the end. But like, at what cost is that, and why do only certain folks have to make that sacrifice while others are truly able to invest in their long-term security? And so that kind of I've really fixated on the connection or lack of connection between policy and systems and the people that are impacted by those policies and systems, and have wanted to kind of unpack that from all different angles. What keeps me going, I think the last year for sure has been, we've seen some incredible movement within the philanthropic sector to try new things, to do things differently. I actually just left the philanthropic sector after 10 years to embark on a new adventure fighting poverty in California with former Stockton Mayor Michael Tubbs. And I'm super excited about that. But I also think about philanthropy a lot, especially now as a grant seeker. And one of the things I've thought about is that, philanthropy has been very focused on incremental change, things that we can neatly wrap our head around and understand attribution and impact of dollars, rather than those underlying systems challenges. So really what that's meant from my perspective, and what I've heard from grantees over the years, a real underinvestment in organizing policy, narrative change. These things require long-term patient capital, and I know we'll be talking about that more. I think also there's been some really hopeful movement in acknowledging the role of race and thinking about the problems that we're trying to solve, and speaking about that plainly, and not kind of shying away from what might feel uncomfortable conversations. And then the last thing that I think is a tricky dynamic to navigate in philanthropy is a bit of this paternalism and prescribing solutions without necessarily always engaging impacted communities in those solutions. And so I continue to be really inspired about trust-based philanthropy and how we can incorporate that more into our work.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that perspective. Before sort of opening up with a question, Camille, if I can come back to you, as relates to the work that you're currently doing, we'd love to hear a little bit more about that. How does sort of your broader background and experience kind of fit with where you find yourself today at Brookings and the work that you're currently doing?
Oh, great. Thanks, Sampriti. So currently I run a program at Brookings called the Race, Prosperity, and Inclusion Program, and we really focus on the economic mobility of poor and low-income Americans and communities of color. And the work that I do there is certainly a bit larger than financial inclusion, but certainly financial inclusion is a very large part of what we do. But very much like Elena, that work is motivated by seeing such huge gaps in the various communities in the US and long-standing and persistent low mobility patterns, particularly for communities of color, particularly for low-income communities of color, and especially for Black and Native American men. And so very motivated to figure out what we can do that is different that will change that pattern. And I'm very passionate about, doing this work so that I leave, this earth in a much better shape than I found it with respect to those kinds of problems. My background is deeply public policy. I've done it at the international level. I've done it at the local level, regional, state. And I've done it in a variety of different contexts. So, at the World Bank, which is a multilateral institution, at the CFPB, which is a government regulatory institution, and then nonprofit as well as for-profit institutions. So it's given me an opportunity to see how you move policy ahead in a variety of different ways. And it's given me a particular perspective on the philanthropic role of moving policy forward. And so I hope that's something that we'll be able to talk about a little bit more as we get into the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And since you both raised policy and narrative change, let me sort of start there. We certainly are seeing donors both more willing to and more attuned to the need for narrative change and philanthropic sort of strategic intervention there. I guess I would step back and ask the broader question of how we might seize the emerging opportunity to basically shift the national discourse on in two areas. The first is who deserves and who is deserving of investments from the government. There is a real sort of tension between the individual versus the system dialogue that we see. Systems and policies, as you rightly noted, Elena, play an overwhelmingly large role in generating economic opportunity and by extension or by opposition, denying economic opportunity and mobility for people. Yet the ethos of individual effort as the path to economic mobility continues to gain and continues to guide a lot of strategy choices related to economic opportunity. Is there an opportunity to flip the script, and or are there successes that you can see or that you might point to that help to elevate and change the dialogue from the individual to the system? Elena, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, it's such a great question and one I've been thinking about a lot. And I think, fundamental to this notion that, we're blaming, do we put the onus on people or the systems and structures in which they're living? One of the most pervasive narratives that we hear a lot is, just work hard and play by the rules and everything is going to be fine. And from, potentially a low wage worker's perspective, you're working multiple jobs with low wages, no worker protections, no benefits. You're risking your health during a pandemic. You can't be there for your kids. There are so many infinite reasons why that alone, the kind of work hard mentality, which and on its surface is very good, but can be oversimplified and completely misunderstood. And so I think a lot of this, frankly, is grounded in some pretty racist tropes that we have about deservedness and worth. including the all too familiar myth of the welfare queen, the idea that people are gaming the system to get out of work. And sadly, I think it's having a really dramatic resurgence now in the economic recovery when we're talking about things reopening and people going back to work, and these kind of notions about laziness and again tied to deservedness and worth. I think that there are a few promising ways to tackle it. One, I think you can actually leverage journalism as a mechanism to tell a story grounded in facts and history. And I just always go back to the 1619 Project, launched in 2019, marking the 400th anniversary of the beginning of American slavery. And that really, like, taking it on and in a very thoughtful way, kind of demystifying or unraveling like what has really gotten us to where we are. I also would just say, I think using, we have frames, we can't shift the narrative, and I would argue the narrative ends up shaping policy without tackling our frames of how we think about those living in poverty. And there are a few. I mean, I think one is what we're talking about here, Sampriti, that you just said, was we blame the poor. They just didn't pull their bootstraps up high enough or didn't work hard enough. Another one I would argue that we see sometimes in our sector is that we pity the poor, that we're here with the answers and we're going to swoop in and save the day. So what I'm most excited about is building that third narrative that's, that we shape and strengthen together, that believes in the inherent dignity of those living in poverty and that they're worthy and deserving of economic opportunity, of systems that are set up for their success and not their failure. And using data is a key part of how we can flip that script that you mentioned. I think we've seen that done with fines and fees, for example, where we look at the disparate impact of government imposed fines, often in the criminal justice system, on low income people of color. We saw that kind of blown up with the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, where the DOJ got involved and we started to unpack that data and the injustice of it all, and that led to reforms. And also you can innovate with an evaluation and data lens that dispels narratives, which was done in Stockton, for example, with guaranteed income, where we try something new and crazy, and then we, lo and behold, are able to show people actually use the extra cash to put food on the table and go get some additional job training opportunities instead of wasting it away on drugs or alcohol. So I think the use of data is really important, and I want to conclude with just one thing that I also, as much as I want to ground myself, and I think we ground the field in data, that's not always going to work. It just is the sad reality that the facts, the figures, even the messengers don't always work. And that's where you really have to appeal to folks' values and the heart.
Wonderful. Camille, what would you add to that?
Well, that was, thank you, Elena, for, a very eloquent and impressive, I think, discussion of narrative change and where we might have some opportunities. I will just add to that, in this country, we have a couple of cross-cutting narratives that I think are quite damaging that we need to address directly, and some of which Elena had mentioned. But in general, we tend to undervalue wage earners. And we particularly undervalue certain types of wage earners. So Latinos and Latinas are probably the least valued in our sort of hierarchy of wage earners. Immigrants are pretty low, not very highly valued. We don't pay them well. We don't give them benefits, et cetera. So that is, that is a kind of something that's in the water that I think just needs to change. And I'll go back to, where we have some opportunities there, but we also have some very racist / gendered narratives. So Elena had mentioned the trope of the welfare queen. Those are Black women. When we're talking about welfare queens, we're talking about Black women. There's a whole narrative about lazy Black women when we know that in order for slavery to really move forward, you had to depend on women to procreate, women to do all these other things that were going on in the slave system. Today, you know, all women, particularly Black women, are the ones that tend to be wage earners for a variety of reasons that have to do with the racist and gendered narrative around Black men, which is that they are both lazy and violent and people that you need to lock away. And when you lock them away, then women are left to raise families, et cetera. So I think we still have some reckoning to do with respect to specific tropes and specific stereotypes. And so that said, you know, that is kind of what undergirds kind of part of this discussion about who deserves and who doesn't. It's because we actually, you know, the US really thinks about gendered and racist stereotypes. We don't talk about, you know, white working class people in the same way, even though they do in larger numbers get welfare, right? They do in larger numbers, they're Medicaid recipients. So we don't have that same trope there. So one of the interesting things that's happened, and this is what I think I'm going to conclude with, is that over the period of the pandemic, we had the CARES Act, and then we had the American Rescue Plan, both of which assumed that people who were getting the aid really were not responsible for the position that they were in. And when we look at the data of how that money was spent, so additional unemployment benefits and a whole range of other benefits, we see that people did a couple of things. So particularly low-income people used it to pay bills, to kind of set some aside if they were able to do that, or at least keep afloat. Some actually used it to pay for training to do something different that was higher paid. And so what we see is that despite whatever those narratives are, there are opportunities when people have them and they have the resources to be able to move up the economic ladder. And so when we're thinking about the role of philanthropy, I think we should be thinking about how do we take the data from the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan and look at how people use that and retool the philanthropic sector so that en masse we can support people who have greater aspirations, who are not supported by a system that is largely racist and somewhat sexist, and how do we propel them to their aspirations and the aspirations that they have for their children.
Thank you for sharing that perspective. I want to come back to the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan and sort of this policy window. Before I do, however, I want to acknowledge Andrea asked a great question, and I should have started with this, which is her question was, can you please define financial inclusion and how that relates to asset building, economic justice, and community wealth? And it's a really important question. It's foundational because the field gets stuck quite a bit on wealth versus income and how we measure that. I would be curious, if I were to turn the question to you, how would you define financial inclusion? And to the discussion we just had about narrative change, is there a way to think about it in the way that we should?
That's a great question. Thank you so much for that. That will be one that I think we'll all need to give some thought to, and there's no spot on answer. But I guess when I think about financial inclusion, I think about a system, a financial system, a government system that is set up to reach and to serve, to help grow those who have the most barriers. And so if like similar to the curb cut effect that Angela Glover Blackwell has talked about for years, this idea that if you kind of center the folks who have the most challenges, that you're really building a truly inclusive system, because the idea is that others will follow and be included in that. So I think that's one quality and thing I would say about financial inclusion. The other one I would say is that financial inclusion is two things. It's about the here and now and giving opportunity for families to meet their basic needs. And it's about building wealth and building assets. And I feel like we've gotten into this trap of like seeing one or the other, prioritizing one over the other. And I just would say a truly inclusive system and financial inclusion prioritizes both. Camille, I'm curious what you would say.
Yeah, I think that those are, I really like that. And I would just add to it that I think it's a combination of the formal financial system, the informal financial systems that allow families to meet their current financial needs, to put savings away so that they can build assets, to meet any emergencies, and to be able to do what makes them happy, right? So there has to be, the system has to work well enough for them to, if they want to invest in their kids, or they want to go on vacations, or they want to give to their church, or they want to have a quinceañera, or whatever it is, that they can do that and do it without a lot of financial stress. So I would say it also has to be a system that doesn't impose a set of values. So the reason I want to stress this is, going back to sort of our origin stories here that you heard about first, there is a kind of norm in sort of the financial sector that the responsible management of money means, for instance, you don't give money to your kids. They should be like on their own, except when they need down payments for houses, which is kind of a more, I would say, mainstream American approach. But otherwise, they're kind of left to themselves, right? And that is a particular, maybe even Protestant kind of set of values that doesn't work for everyone in the US. And so financial inclusion also means being inclusive of the types of values that a range of families have here.
Can I just add one quick thing that you got me thinking about, Camille, is when we think about financial inclusion, both in terms of both basic needs and wealth, we actually do have policies and systems that are pitting those things against each other. And the one I want to call out is the asset test for many public benefits. So if you save, if you actually want to do the financially smart thing to do and start saving money, you're kicked off of your benefits. And so there is a built-in financial disincentive to build wealth in order to stay on, to receive the safety net, the basic needs that you're receiving.
Yep, agreed. A definite policy opportunity in places that have not made those changes.
Since you both mentioned sort of the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan, as well as the experiment in Stockton, in many ways, we can look back over the past couple of years and say there have been moments where we might be able to both change the discourse, but potentially change policy. And direct cash transfers are certainly one example of that. That said, you have also, I think, talked about where policies are at tension with one another. And, we can talk about direct cash transfers. We can also look at things like the broader tax codes, the home mortgage interest deduction, preferential capital gains, the ability to shield a lot of wealth and assets from taxes that are far more significant and profound and contribute much more significantly to the inability or the ability to pass wealth on from one generation to the next. And continue to be baked within that are the racist, gendered, not born here, not from here types of values that come with that. How do we foster a more fact-based national discourse on solutions and strategies for mobility what are the things that we can point to coming out of this moment that give you some opportunity for hope, and that maybe are places where philanthropy needs to continue to sustain its focus?
All right, I'll give that a stab. I think, I mentioned a couple already. One was, I do think journalism is a kind of deeply maybe unappreciated and powerful mechanism to foster fact-based discourse. And again, we'll just reference the 1619 Project. In the example I talked about in Ferguson, having the Department of Justice get involved and have to point out decades of reliance on wealth stripping from people involved in the criminal justice system, that's kind of dramatic. But I think there needs to be that level of investigation and inquiry. And I think philanthropy is well positioned, actually, to help with that. So, that has unleashed, as I said, advocates and advocacy and research and analysis to really shed light on the problem itself. And then finally, with these, Camille, you're talking about this tremendous opportunity we've had at the federal level to disperse cash to people in need. There is so much opportunity to learn from that. And same with the Stockton experiment. And, the people who are designing those experiments or running programs are not often the people who can design the evaluation and the robust research that's needed to dispel the myths. And so, again, I see this as a really wonderful place for philanthropy to get involved and say, what can we learn from this? And that research in turn can start to shape an entirely different narrative.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think that there's certainly been some opportunities, really recent opportunities to, review data about what people do when things are shaken up and we do, disperse cash without a narrative around deserving and undeserving. The one point that I do want to make is that there are lots of different kinds of facts. And so certainly the ones we're talking about are ones where we've just talked about with the CARES Act, et cetera, are ones where you actually have quantitative data. But I think what is really important when you're thinking about philanthropic strategy and strategic plans is if your goal is to be able to increase economic mobility, increase opportunities for people to be part of mainstream society and to build wealth, et cetera, what you really are talking about are individuals who are enmeshed in a community. And so as a philanthropic funder, then what you have to think about is how do people in communities move ahead? So what are those vectors? What are those transmission mechanisms? Some of them are, financial, and we've seen that with the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan. Others are the connections those people have. And research that I've done has shown that those connections really vary by race considerably across the US. They vary by gender. And so if you have a goal, for instance, of trying to increase the mobility of Latinas, newly arrived at Latinas, then you have to figure out how do you as philanthropic funders increase the opportunities for Latinas who are newly arrived to have larger social networks that can allow them to understand where there are jobs, understand where there are educational opportunities or better housing opportunities for their kids, et cetera. So part of the data that you need to capture is data around who knows who and how those transmission mechanisms of economic mobility, learning about opportunities, how that actually works in specific communities.
Thank you for sharing that perspective. I think maybe picking up on that theme a little bit around sort of these micro decisions or sort of micro targeting, One mistake that commonly is made in philanthropy, and frankly in policy, is assuming that an idea that works in one city or region will work in all cities and regions if it's scaled through philanthropy and impact investing. And this belief often leads to the deployment of pilots that are then studies for years, and eventually, if they're scaled if they're deemed a success. But presumably there are other ways to sort of, and other avenues for scaling impact. Why not grow programs in communities that we know work in those places? There's probably a need for a more nuanced conversation and the most effective and equitable way to scale financial equity strategies. And this discussion may also present opportunities to challenge some conventions in philanthropy, the way that they define risk. Elena, maybe I can ask you, given the Stockton experiment, what were some of the lessons learned that you think have implications for how to think about scale? And maybe what are some mistakes or maybe things to avoid as we think about those types of models?
Yeah, I think this is such an important question and pretty tricky. So, on one hand, I do think that it's a real thing that many organizations feel pressure from their funders to scale. And sometimes that can kind of, without thinking through all of the implications of like human capital or HR, financial infrastructure, it can kind of like get you into this false sense of I can do this. And also it would be great to have that extra support. So I wanted to just name that, but you also don't want to miss real opportunities for greater impact. We all, I would hope, want that. So if something's working, how can we make it work somewhere else and not assume? And so for me, I guess what I come down to is being able to question our assumptions. And whenever we're talking about scale, and again, I don't think scale is bad. I think we want good solutions to spread, but we want them to spread and succeed. And what we know and what you're saying here, Sampriti, is like, we know that if it's expanded without thinking about the nuances, it can be set up to fail. So anyway, the questions I would ask myself for anyone like thinking about scale is, scale to what end, who is benefiting from that, and what assumptions might we be making about like, differences within community that might impact a program's success. And in the Stockton experiment, it is so exciting to see how there are now guaranteed income pilots across the country. And also, I would say, I see pilots as a means and not an end in and of itself. And so in order to make that bridge from means to end, I think it does mean that you have to look at, why did it succeed in Stockton? What are all the elements there? And then learn from these other experiments as well. And figure out, okay, there might be a common framework, that it's not our place to say how you spend your money, that people and families are best positioned to do that. But the way that framework is implemented can vary pretty dramatically.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would say, Sampriti, you identified, I think, one issue with scaling, which is that, sometimes the assumption is it worked in place A, so it should work in all these other places. I think there are a number of issues with the sort of concept of scaling the way it's approached by a lot of philanthropic funders. The first is that when we're talking about scale, like if you want to affect something like economic mobility or drive down poverty or increase, wages to $15 an hour, this is something that requires a large actor, right? So philanthropic funders are not that large actor. That large actor is either the state or the federal government, right? So if you want to affect millions of people and you're talking about scale, then you're talking about something like the CARES Act, the American Rescue Plan. So the kind of scale that philanthropic funders think about is not possible given the tools that they have. So they really have to rely on other actors to get that level of scale. So that's the first thing. So I think it's a misnomer. And I think it's because it's trendy and it sounds like you're kind of in tune with sort of the gestalt of Silicon Valley, which is you pick this one thing, it solves many of your problems, and poof, they all go away. So as we all know, all kinds of issues like economic mobility and financial inclusion, they are derived from a whole set of circumstances, whole set of systems, historical legacies, enduring racism, enduring sexism, et cetera. It's not possible to have one thing that will solve all that. So I just want to kind of dispel that. And I know that that's a pretty direct hit, but I think that's kind of where things are. So when you're then talking about scaling, you're not talking about millions of people. What you are talking about is having an impact in a specific place. And when you are talking about having an impact in a specific place, then you have to figure out, what do you mean by that? So is it the number of people? Is it the ripple effect that your program is going to have on kids, on family, on health, on the environment, et cetera? So those are all things to consider. Is it the ripple effect you'll have on social networks within which those folks are embedded? And to what degree are your programs or approaches informed by community voice, which then gives it its specific flavor and gives it the kind of impact that will be appreciated in that specific community. So if you're a philanthropy and you're thinking about scale, you're really thinking about deep, not wide. And you're thinking about, how do I get voices in that can help me have the deepest impact possible?
Thank you for sharing that. Since you raised it, and I'll ask one last question, I invite anyone in the audience to ask their questions as well in the chat box, which is, how do we shape a more authentic and useful definition and practice of community engagement? The status quo of community engagement by philanthropy historically and at times has been aimed at checking a box rather than making and creating the space to be constructively challenged and to be pushed into areas of discomfort that can yield genuine community partnership and sustainable partnership and sort of co-created solutions. It can generate actual power sharing in the distribution of capital. And ultimately, it can be, of course, much more effective. But what are ways that you have seen or that you would advise to engage in this in a more meaningful way between philanthropy and communities?
I have to say I have participated in many strategies that have felt very checkboxy, and so I've really held myself more accountable over time and in how to prevent that, because I do think the checkbox type of mentality to community engagement is really like a cosmetic way to mask some underlying paternalism that we feel in philanthropy or in government, that we know the answers before we've asked anyone about their experience. And so for me, I think authentic community engagement involves a few things. It takes time, and that's often like not working with the checkbox thing. So you want to hold a community forum by this date. It's not necessarily building in the time that you need to really get authentic feedback from community. It takes trust. Again, that's related to time, because it takes time to build trust. I think it takes resources. So, if you want to have a real conversation with community, think about the time that you hold that session. Is it during work hours? Are you providing childcare? How are people going to get there? I think that takes resources. And then it takes humility to kind of go in and say, I come with a novice beginner's mindset, and I don't know. And that's where I'm really interested in how we can leverage human-centered design principles here. You don't walk in with any preconceived notions. You take time to follow someone and really start to understand the real issues. you know, just a couple quick examples was one was Stanford, who had the guy who had designed this MRI machine was watching young kids experience it with complete trauma. Like it's not a nice thing to look at, an MRI machine. And with that lens, started to engage kids in designing what could be more of a, you know, fun experience that had color and sight and smell and all of the senses activated. Or you know, I think sometimes we try and think, why are kids not succeeding in school? Well, back in the 60s, the Black Panther Party actually understood something so profound, yet so simple, which is children can't learn if they're hungry. And they started the free breakfast program in the 60s. And initially, the feds thought they were trying to discredit it. But soon after, the US implemented a national school breakfast program built on that framework created by the Black Panther Party. So I think it just kind of sums up how we say sometimes in this sector, you know, the people who are closest to the challenges are closest to the solutions. And I think these are some examples of that.
Yeah, I know we want to get into question and answer, so I'm really just going to add a couple more points to Elena's excellent discussion here, particularly around humility. So really, when you are engaging the community, you are learning, and you have to come from that position, which is that, you know, your point of departure is, I'm here to learn, and it's really a very deep exercise in disrupting power dynamics. And so that's, I think, probably one of the most important things. The second thing I would add before we go into the Q&A is often, even if the discussion is not a check the box necessarily discussion, you tend to rely on groups and people you know well. And I think it's really important to think about who's not in the room and who you're not reaching out to. You know, oftentimes we all tend to rely on people who, you know, even though their backgrounds might be humble, you know, they actually went to college and they speak like us and everything else. Well, it's important to get the people who didn't finish high school, whose English isn't the best, you know, who have actually are like in the middle of some situation that is difficult. It's really important to make sure those folks are included too.
Thank you for sharing that perspective. One of the first questions we have actually builds right off of that, which is, how can we, advocates and funders, support the people and communities we're working with to help them develop their own political power to change systems on their own terms, as opposed to us channeling their vision into the established channels to change and or reform systems? Electoral, sure, but what else?
So I'll actually jump in here and just say that there are a lot of opportunities to get folks and communities involved in data collection in their own communities, and to figure out not only how to collect the data, how to talk about it, how to analyze it, and how to utilize it for whatever purposes that they want.
Yeah, that's powerful. And I guess what I would add is, you know, there are so many really incredible community groups who are working on just that. How do we build power? How do we create pipelines of leadership within our own communities, so that instead of relying on the executive director, program director's voice, you're cultivating leadership. And so I think more actively funding, I mean, those are often the least funded kind of organizations because they don't always have the most tangible outcomes. And certainly it's not like a 6-month or a year-long endeavor. It takes a long time for that. Those groups are often doing a lot of the political organizing that focuses on the priorities of those leaders that they are cultivating and learning from along the way. So the priorities aren't dictated by the organization themselves. And then the other thing is, I think faith-based communities are a really important place to focus. And there are incredible groups doing work to build leadership and create movements really around some of the issues we care about the most.
Very focused on justice as well. So thank you for sharing that. Camille, this may be a question directed to you, but I would invite both of those perspectives, which is, how do we get philanthropy to invest in addressing the technology barriers that low income communities face that prevent them from accessing the financial system? And how do we get, the question disappeared on me, and how do we get philanthropy to help coordinate among, at times, competing financial regulations and financial regulators?
Okay, great. So let me talk about the regulator and regulations first. I do think that when you talk about regulatory work, philanthropies as well as a range of advocacy organizations should be in constant discussion with regulators, and there are many avenues to do that. I mean, having been a regulator, I'm aware of those. I would encourage everyone who's interested in making sure that low income and communities of color have access to the financial system in a way that works for them. Would encourage you to establish dialogues with the regulators and to keep those dialogues moving. The other opportunity is regulation is always there's usually an opportunity to comment on regulation. A lot of groups are really good at doing that. If you're a philanthropy and it's your first time doing it, it's something that's worth doing. And so that's another way of having dialogue with regulators. In terms of any conflicting regulations, that's something that you bring up to regulators, like X doesn't harmonize with Y, and you talk about solutions. So that's what regulators are looking for. So it's pretty practical. With respect to, sorry, what was the first part of that question, Sampriti?
How do we get philanthropies to invest in addressing the technology barriers? Yeah.
Right, exactly. So, the technology barriers are usually money barriers, is how I'm going to discuss this, right? Because we think about broadband, which we realized during the pandemic, if we didn't realize it before, didn't reach everybody in the U.S. And that likely, more than likely, that was because people couldn't afford to get the broadband. Sometimes it was because of, there just wasn't fiber optics there, but that can be solved in a variety of different ways by pointing out to Google or whoever else, Xfinity, that you need to invest in this particular area. And then there are philanthropic arms for those corporations that will do that. But most people who didn't have broadband didn't have it because they couldn't afford it. So that's the technology barrier there. Then the technology barrier around phones and tablets, et cetera, is, again, it's because people don't have that. They don't have the money to afford that. So one of the things I think that's really important when we think about infrastructure, in this moment in the federal government, we're talking about infrastructure, is making sure that when you're working with schools or county officials or city officials or whatever, that you're having a discussion about who has access to these technologies that are very important to be able to access financial systems, school, et cetera. Who has them and who doesn't, and that there be a specific set aside for those groups and those people in a county, in a city, who do not currently have access to that. I think that's going to be an important opportunity. There's a small window, it's probably now through next July, for philanthropies to really focus on having that conversation at the local level.
Wonderful. Let me ask another question here, which is coming from a donor. In your view, what are the most important investments philanthropy could make to build more financial inclusion now? Are there specific policy windows that are open at this moment? Are there windows we could open in the medium term and invest towards? Do we need to make grants differently to seize those opportunities? So in addition to sort of tactics, maybe thinking about, is there a way to speed up or seize a particular moment?
You know, I think one of the there is a policy window now, and I think there are always different windows that you can kind of open more widely and take advantage of, frankly. But I think the one that we have now is a pending economic crisis and the fallout from like the racial injustice that now has become front and center that communities have been experiencing forever. And so the confluence of those two things to me does present quite a policy window. And that's where we're able to, you know, get things through like the CARES Act and what we've already talked about. And there's, I think, potential to do more. So there's infinite answers to this question, but I think a couple that I'll focus on. You know, part of creating opportunity and financial inclusion is meeting people's basic needs. Right now, we do have a safety net that is incredibly frayed and incredibly difficult to access. It also leaves out people who really need it, and including formerly incarcerated folks or undocumented folks. So I would say, you know, there's a lot happening right now at the federal level around investing in the care infrastructure. Who are the people who take care of our children, who take care of the elderly, mostly women of color, frankly, and how can we build a better safety net for them, which by extension for all of us. And I think investing in things like paid family leave and childcare, all of these things are going to be really incredible. And we have a moment of opportunity right in front of us. I have to make a plug for baby bonds. I think that, you know, as we think about the safety net and basic needs right now, we also have a policy window and opportunity to consider bold solutions that really address the racial wealth gap. And that's through an investment in children at birth in a way that can grow over time. And the do things differently, I think that it requires such long-term patient capital. There may or may not be wins within 1 year, 5 years, maybe 10, but it needs to be there for the long haul.
Yeah, I would add to that a couple of things. I think, you know, I agree with Elena on almost everything there. I would say use this moment to think about how we create all jobs with benefits. Jobs, you know, living wages with benefits. You want to think about financial inclusion, you have to have money. And I think that's like the basic. But like I think you can't get any more foundational. Then I would say that, you know, when we look at statistics, Native American boys and Black African American boys are usually at the bottom of every statistic. You want to make some inroads, really focus on creating a culture of care for those boys, both at home, in school, out of school. Then I would say that we also have to focus on returning citizens. Returning citizens tend to be, particularly returning citizens of color, tend to be very young, people who have their whole lives ahead of them. So we need to figure out how to support them and make sure they're integrated into the economic mainstream. And the final thing that I would say is that we really have to think about how we as a country move away from seeing, you know, policies as something that that people somehow are that somehow people are victims, and that somehow, you know, these policies step up, but really as how these policies really enhance all of us. And I think that's, you know, for philanthropy to create that narrative is really, really important. The last thing I will say is that, you know, we all want to live in nice places, places with parks, places that, you know, are just pleasant to live in. Think about the place you live and think about some of the places that the people we care about live in, and figure out how to invest in those or get investors involved in those, so that those are also nice places to live. That built infrastructure, I think, is huge as well. Those are the areas that I would focus on.
Wonderful. Let me maybe ask one other sort of nerdy policy question, and then I'll close us out, which is how should we think about the interplay of federal, state, local policy advances? Are they equally valuable? What are the really, really big levers to focus on each? Are there levers that can be pulled in concert for even more impact? And I think about that question because we have so many place-based funders. But I'm curious if you have a point of view in this moment on that question.
I'll be quick because I know we're almost out of time. I would say that the opportunity for innovation and new ideas and doing things differently, which we still have a lot of challenges in front of us, is really at the local level. And so, you know, not to minimize any other level, but that's if you really want to spark innovation and learning and be able to fail quickly and get better, that's where I think you can do some really exciting work.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would say that if you want large scale change, leverage federal and state dollars and utilize any waivers that come with those policies, because those waivers will also allow you to innovate at the local level.
Wonderful. Well, I think this is an opportune moment for us to maybe put a bow on our conversation. I believe the audience has gotten some very, very sort of directive guidance and some, suggestions for new things to think about. I think from where we sit, I just want to thank you both for joining us today and for provoking us to look differently at the challenge of strengthening financial security. The scholarship, the empathy, the personal stories you bring to this issue are impressive and inspiring. We've covered a lot of ground, but there are a few takeaways that I noted and want to offer that up in closing and would invite you to add to that as topics, I think, for this collective and virtual community to think about. The first is around changing the narrative. We definitely need to reframe how we think about workers, especially workers of color, and their role and responsibility, and that the systems that have constrained them. I think the second is maybe defining financial inclusion as a goal. It involves having a government and a financial system that is set up to help grow and support those who are facing the most barriers without imposing a particular set of values from the outset. It considers both the formal financial system and the informal systems that many people use, and it addresses both basic needs and opportunities to build wealth. Understanding economic mobility and financial inclusion is socially mediated. It's crucial to bear in mind that people exist in social networks and that economic mobility works through such networks differently in different communities. Philanthropists who want to support people within a particular community need to understand those networks, which are sometimes, but not always, hyperlocal. I think you gave us good guidance on thinking critically about scale and scaling. In thinking about scale, consider scale to what end? Who benefits from it? What assumptions may we be making about the transferability of pilots from one community or circumstance to another? If you want to affect millions of people, you're really talking about what governments do. Philanthropic funders don't really have the resources to scale, despite the desire to be in the gestalt, as you said, with Silicon Valley. When you're talking about scaling in philanthropy, you're really still talking about having an impact in a specific place with a particular community. The impact could be the number of people or the ripple effect. In any case, we need to think about being deep, not wide, perhaps, and that requires bringing in additional voices from the impacted community because those voices and the people they belong to are the only way to go deep. And the last is maybe engaging authentically with new communities. You've given us some great food for thought about wanting to have real dialogue with community, taking the time, building trust, trusting data, bringing humility into the effort. And it's worth thinking about the principles of human-centered design as we enter into those engagements. Crucial to understand the power dynamics, and particularly those who aren't in the room, and inviting the perspectives from those who are least like us. You've given us tremendous fodder to think about. as we emerge from this pandemic and build a stronger financial inclusion sort of spirit and set of actions in this community. Before I say goodbye to all, Camille and Elena would invite sort of last words from you.
I just wanted to, oh,
go ahead. Go ahead, Elena.
I just wanted to thank you. That's the most amazing summary. I could not add anything better. And also just want to say I learned so much being in dialogue with both of you. So thank you for the opportunity.
And I will just say the same thing. This has been fantastic. Thank you, Sampriti. Thank you, Elena. Really, really have enjoyed your perspectives. And thank the audience for their amazing questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time. We'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you for joining us today. Take care. Bye-bye.